Democracy and Dictatorship, presented by Shkora. Simply clever.
Hello and welcome to Democracy and Dictatorship. I'm Rohit Gandhi, and on today's episode, we're going to look at one of the worst humanitarian crises of our times. The Syrian civil war has claimed the lives of over 400,000 Syrians, and more than 4.5 million Syrians have been forced to flee the country. A recent military offensive by the Syrian army has managed to recapture 90% of eastern Aleppo from the rebels. The world community has come out in support of the civilians suffering in the region. But peace still seems like a distant dream. The international media and politicians have been commenting heavily on the crisis. Most have not held back from taking sides. Some have accused the Americans in partnership with the Saudis and the Qataris for interfering in Syria. Others have accused the Russians and Bashar al-Assad of genocide. Others have blindly supported military action in eastern Aleppo. To help put the situation in perspective, here's our correspondent Daniele Pagani, looking back at how this entire war began and the major events since then.
In April 2011, people took to the street in Dara, a city in southern Syria. They were protesting against the arrest and beating of a group of children by security forces. They had written anti-government slogans on the walls. Protests exploded all over Syria. People were demanding more democracy and more freedom to dissent. This led to clashes with security forces. 1,000 civilians and 150 policemen died. The smaller conflict soon becomes a war. In an attempt to cool down the situation, in 2012, President Bashar al-Assad calls a constitutional referendum. 90% of Syrians vote for the possibility to have a multi-party system. But it was not enough. A UN ceasefire proposal failed and the situation got worse. Neighboring countries soon got involved in the war. Lebanese Hezbollah sent troops and weapons to support government forces, as did Iran. By late 2013, the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra became the two main anti-Assad groups, fighting and controlling nearly half of the country. The Syrian government starts accusing the United States, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Qatar of supporting them. In return, the United States and the United Nations accuse Syria of using chemical weapons. Assad denies usage but agrees to destroy his stored chemical weapons. Badly in need of international legitimacy, Assad organizes and wins the first multi-candidate presidential elections. The United States step in and starts supporting the Syrian Kurds in their fight against the Islamic State with airstrikes. The Kurdish advance is successful and they secure a large swath of land in northern Syria. Assad requests then Russia to formally help fight terrorism in Syria. Russia aids with heavy air intervention, the most known being eastern Aleppo. The United States and its regional allies accuse Russia, Syria and their allies of committing war crimes. Assad accuses the United States of having sponsored Al-Qaeda. After months of heavy bombing, rebels surrender in eastern Aleppo, but large parts of Syria are still under control of the Islamic State and al-Nusra. Kurds in the north are attacking the Islamic State's capital Raqqa, with the United States their support. Russia, Iran, Lebanon and increasingly Turkey keep supporting Assad with funds and troops. In short, Syria has become the war of wars.
The Syrian civil war is not about Syria anymore, about its people and their demand of freedom and democracy. It has become a power struggle between regional and international power who are fighting for the hegemony on Western Asia, and civilians bear the brunt of this heavy fight. Daniele Pagani in New Delhi for WION.
The love for Syria's oil made many players interested in the country. The Americans wanted to impose their style of democracy, but the route that was taken was to use armed rebel groups that were funded in the region. The Syrian government also showed no restraint and tried to clamp down on the protests that erupted. President Bashar al-Assad was accused of being a dictator and the heir of a political dynasty that began with his father. Despite that, Assad won a landslide victory in the 2014 elections. But what was the real nature of those elections? How democratic were they? And the environment in which they took place? Was it even fair to have elections? Here's the breakdown on how those elections unfolded.
In June 2014, in the middle of a civil war claiming 1,000 lives a week, Syria held its first multi-candidate presidential election. In 2000 and 2007, Syrians could only vote yes or no to President Bashar al-Assad, who unsurprisingly won both times with nearly 100% of preferences. In 2014, despite the ongoing crisis, more than 73% Syrians voted and Bashar al-Assad won by a landslide of almost 90% of the votes. But the result polarized the world. Assad's allies claimed it was a significant step towards democracy and proof of his people's support. Russia, Iran, Brazil and North Korea promptly congratulated the president for his third mandate. However, the UN stated that an election conducted during a war is not in line with the Geneva Convention. Many of Assad's rivals agreed. The US, the European Union and several in the Arab League judged the results invalid. They too argued that a fair election could not take place during a civil war, in a climate of fear and threats where any opposition was labelled as terrorists. Refugees in Syria's neighbouring and ally countries voted in their embassies, but were denied to do so in the EU, the US, Canada, Egypt, United Emirates and Turkey, where 2.5 million of them live. Refugees who fled Syria illegally were not allowed to vote. As a result, more than 4 million Syrians could not vote in 2014. Several Western media denounced the absence of independent monitoring. They pointed out that not voting as a form of protest wasn't really an option in Syria. People feared government retaliation and brutality from security forces. No Syrian political party actually complained officially, and the election was judged valid, a result which greatly increased a badly needed international legitimacy for Assad. Bureau Report, WION.
The conflict in Syria and the humanitarian disaster that took place since is a scathing indictment of international diplomacy. Month by month, year by year, as people's homes and once vibrant cities were razed to the rubble, the international community found itself divided and incapable of acting. WION's Manoj Keval Ramani takes a look at the diplomatic missteps and the missed opportunities that contributed to the Syrian quagmire.
Never again. That's a phrase that has been the rallying cry around the world after a major massacre. From the Holocaust to Rwanda to Bosnia and now Syria. Yet each time the international community has vowed never again. A conflict has emerged to expose the limitations of this resolve in the face of realpolitik. The conflict in Syria began in 2011 as a movement for democratic change, but soon devolved into a geopolitical proxy war. From the very beginning, the US was clear. It wanted the ouster of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. To that end, the Obama administration worked with traditional allies and armed what it termed as moderate rebels. It was an endeavor fraught with missteps. For starters, Assad's close allies Russia and Iran were staunchly opposed to his ouster. That rendered the multiple peace talks in Geneva and discussions of a transitional government ineffective. Moreover, as the Syrian government's control over large swaths of territory weakened, it created fertile ground for the rise of the Islamic State, breeding further sectarian conflict and confusion between the so-called good and bad rebels. There was a moment in 2013 when it seemed that American, if not international intervention was imminent. Obama's now infamous red line on the use of chemical weapons appeared to have been breached. Yet America seemed unwilling to commit to boots on the ground. Ironically, it was this moment that allowed for common ground between the US and Russia. With Moscow facilitating the deal, Assad reportedly gave up his chemical weapons, although there have been reports of government forces using chlorine as a weapon since. But what followed thereafter were deeper cracks in the international community and increased jostling for position among regional players. Despite the multiple resolutions being passed, the United Nations Security Council was rendered powerless owing to competing interests. From Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to Turkey, Iran, Israel, and of course the United States and its Western allies and Russia, each party has had a role to play in rendering the Syrian conflict intractable. Caught in the midst of this failure of international diplomacy are the millions of innocent Syrians whose life and plight, one hopes, will inspire much more going forward than merely the empty slogan of never again. In New Delhi, this is Manoj Kevalramani, WION.
The situation in Syria is truly heartbreaking. At the end of the day, it is also a reflection of our failure as a world community. We're going to take a short break now. When we return, we're going to continue this conversation and try and better understand the challenges that lie ahead for Syria.
Democracy and Dictatorship, presented by Shkora. Simply clever.
Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. Joining us now is KP Fabian, a former diplomat who served in the Indian Foreign Service. He is currently a professor at the Indian Society for International Law. Also with us is Anil Trigunath. He is also a former ambassador of India to Jordan. Let's start by asking you, Anil, what we see today in Syria, literally a society where every law of the world is history. Everything wrong that could have gone because of war seems to be happening. Give us a sense on the ground.
It was inevitable because the way this whole problem in the Middle East and starting with bombing of Libya was brought about, and the engineered revolution there and the problems and creating dissent in Syria was brought about. This was inevitably the result was this kind of a destruction that one has been witnessing and a humanitarian catastrophe that has been perpetrated there. We have always been against any military intervention, any external intervention of this kind, because without knowing the terrain of the country, without understanding the dynamic of the people themselves, the same kind of a solution was being imposed that they tried to do elsewhere. I was ambassador to Libya before, and large number of fighters from Libya were going to Syria to fight. And their training were going on in the neighboring countries, and they were brought in there, and they tried to create a problem in a country which was multicultural, multi-ethnic. That is not to say that these dictators, for that matter, have outlived their utility to some extent, and they have tried to create such a situation that there was some kind of a, not a critical, but at least a suboptimal mass of dissent in the country.
Ambassador Fabian, you were in Beirut, like you mentioned, when the elections in Syria took place. 73% of people seem to have voted for Assad, but obviously that's not a real number. Explain to us the acceptance of Assad within Syria.
Well, I think we have to go back to his father, Hafez al-Assad. How long was he in power? How long was the emergency there? And in 2000, when Bashar al-Assad succeeded his father, there was some expectation that there will be reform. Some promises were made, but they were not carried out. And when the Arab Spring dawned, to start with, in Tunisia, there was a certain sort of demand for reform. And I agree that on that school wall, the school children wrote, this regime should be brought down. But, I personally think that the government overreacted. If Bashar al-Assad had taken a different route, if he had responded, then perhaps history would have been different. And don't forget that whenever there is an opportunity, outside powers, for example, Saudi Arabia was very keen to bring him down because he was close to Iran. And all these...
Qatar as well.
Yeah, Qatar as well. All these, reasons are there.
India connection. And explain to us, how does something that unfolds in the Middle East impact India and South Asia directly?
Well, in India's case, they are our extended neighborhood. And whatever happens in the Middle East, for many reasons. One reason is we have a huge diaspora, which is almost 8 million people, who are sending almost $50–60 billion to India in remittances. We also are dependent for about 70% of our oil and gas needs from the Middle East. And therefore, strategically, it is extremely important for us to see that the region remains stable. Now, as far as Syria is concerned, again, we have very historical ties with them for decades. And centuries, I must say. And therefore, any disturbance in the region, apart from the terrorism, because see, this is now the whole area is being infested by terrorism. And we have been suffering from terrorism from across the border now for 4 decades. And it has mutated to a much harsher, much violent form of extremism. And we are obviously extremely concerned for that. So from our point of view, both economically, politically, strategically, this region is extremely important, and we need to continue to make efforts that it does not spiral out of control.
Going on, Mr. Ambassador Fabian, to talk about the impact of this war on the people and the kind of size of refugees it has created, turmoil in Europe, all the way to North America. Where does this stop? How can these people be brought back home in Syria?
Well, the population of Syria was about 22.5 million, out of which 8 million at least are internally displaced, and 4.5 million or above are outside Syria. And of course, Germany was inundated, and we have all seen how that affected the politics of Germany, and Angela Merkel is in some trouble because of the warm welcome she extended to the Syrians once. So there has been a turn towards the far right in Europe, which, well, to my mind, it is rather deplorable. But then, that's what happens when people get discontented with the establishment. Then the pendulum swings, and sometimes it overswings, too much in the wrong direction. So that is there. And then even European Union, its coherence has been affected. I mean, Hungary doesn't want anyone, and other countries have different, Austria, for example. And so you can see a certain unraveling of the, ever closer union, which the European Union wanted once upon a time. And now, of course, we have the Brexit also. So that also is.
There has been a global outfall of the Syrian crisis on how the world interacts in some level.
Yeah, and also some sort of Islamophobia, which is, to my mind, is irrational, because, you cannot say that, people belonging to a particular religion, all of them, are responsible for certain things. You can't.
Sure.
I may.
Sure.
Sorry.
No worries, go ahead.
I have visited some of these camps, refugee camps in Jordan, and there are about 1.4 million refugees said to be there, about 600–700 in those camps.
And a lot of them on the border areas.
On the border areas. And talking to them, most of them would like to return. And we also visited one of the places where Canadians were taking 25,000 each. Right. And many of the families, even though after registering, wriggled out of it, they didn't want to go to those places. So essentially, they want to return to their countries. Right. That is one thing which is across rather common.
And which a lot of people don't understand. Let's take a quick break now. More on the Syrian crisis when we return.
Democracy and Dictatorship, Presented by Shkora. Simply clever.
Welcome back to the show. We've been talking with KP Fabian and Anil Trigunayat on the ongoing civil war in Syria. Now let's take a step back, gentlemen. Let's look at 2003, when the Americans went in for this intervention and mostly unilaterally decided that the lines in the Middle East have to be redrawn, pump in democracy, extract as much dictatorship as possible. Let's start with you, Mr. Fabian. Do you think it's a failed experiment for the Americans?
Well, I personally consider the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq as one of the unwisest decisions ever taken. You know, it was an unnecessary war, and it was sold out to the public on the basis of lies uttered again and again in a brazen fashion. And I don't know what the intention was, because you know, it is true that there was interest in the oil wealth of Iraq, but the belief that Jeffersonian democracy can be implanted in Iraq, well, I'm sorry to say that anyone who had that belief, that person's head needs to be examined. And we all know the differences between the Department of State and the Pentagon, how to run the show, and how casually the Iraqi state was dismantled by Paul Bremer. He just said, you know, disband the army, and anyone who had anything to do with the Ba'athist party, throw him out. So the belief was that you could destroy the state of Iraq and then recreate it. Now this is most ironical, because the idea of the state more or less originated in Iraq and of course in Egypt also. But what I'm trying to say is one of the earliest states in the world. So this is arrogance combined with ignorance, which is very toxic.
What we saw come out of Iraq, you know, the destruction of the Ba'ath Party, anybody who was part of the Ba'ath Party wasn't even allowed to stand for elections in 2003. Now, from there, what we see in Syria is an outcome of what began there in 2003. Anil, would you agree with that?
No, I fully agree. In fact, in my view, this is, as Ambassador Fabian has said, unwisest. But I'll call, in the 20th or 21st century, it can be called a mother of all evils, because this generated the kind of terrorism that we are witnessing today. And removal of Saddam Hussein perhaps was overdue, but at the same time, the way it was done had not been called upon by any system where there is no jungle Raj. So we cannot call it a civilizational conduct of the states in that form. And therefore, it has led to the situation which we are facing today, not only in Iraq, but the whole of Middle East, and the repercussions are being felt across the world. Because these are ideologies that have been perpetrated, they have been allowed to succeed, and even supported by some of these states who are trying to play God in the region. And therefore, one can see that this, the Syria is just a manifestation of that. But then the other states also equally bad. We have seen ISIS landing up in Libya, from where it started, and it is going in the European countries and everywhere else. And it will take a very long while, in my view, before these kind of ideologies will be contained and assuaged in the public mind.
Ambassador Fabian, coming out of this, IS seems to be now spreading based on the idea that they will not have a place in Syria post the expansion of the conflict against the ISIS. They're going to take these attacks to other parts of the world. When and how does the world reach a point of, you know, clamping down on this? Because you're going to see more and more attacks in more parts of the world by IS, originally Al-Qaeda, if you want to call that.
Well, to my mind, IS has two aspects. One is the territory, you know, the state or the caliphate. But even if the territory is removed, IS is also a state of mind. It's an ideological commitment, a sort of state of mind where you are prepared to do anything, kill yourself, for certain political ends. And that, I'm afraid, it will take quite some time to get rid of that state of mind. So even if, they are removed from Raqqa in Syria, which is their sort of formal capital, and of course in Mosul, as you know, there is a stalemate, the war of attrition. And initially the Prime Minister of Iraq had said, we are going to do it. So it's not going to be that easy. Getting them to remove ISIS from the territory, it will be done, I agree, but it's going to take time. But meanwhile, the ISIS ideological
Cleaning the slates,
attraction, I'm sorry to say that attraction might even increase. So we are in trouble, and basically, as I see it, President George Bush's global war on terror has only globalized terror. And that was most unfortunate, unsuccessful and unnecessary war that he waged, starting with the invasion of Iraq and before even Afghanistan, I would say.
Ambassador Fabian, thank you very much for joining us. Ambassador Trigunayat, thank you for joining us. US intervention in the Middle East has sent the region into a spiral of disintegration. Other players have also entered the race. The challenges of the Middle East are internal, but to externally bring democracy to it has thrown the dictatorship into chaos. Choosing a humanitarian path and a sustainable solution to the war is their greatest challenge. But nothing is absolute.
Democracy and Dictatorship, presented by Shkora. Simply clever.